Section 17 of Crime, Its Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 17. Association of Criminals and Their Causes. Subchapter 94. The etiology of associated crime, which is the most important and the most harmful, deserves to be studied by itself. The first cause that may be assigned to this phenomenon is tradition. The long persistence and obstinacy of such associations as the mafia, the camorra, and the brigandage seem to proceed in the first place from the antiquity of their existence, for the long repetition of the same acts transforms them into a habit, and consequently into a law. History teaches us that ethnic phenomena of long duration are not to be eradicated easily at a stroke. The camorra was already existent in Naples in 1568. We know from the edicts of the Spanish viceroys, Count Miranda, the Duke of Alcala, et al., that gamblers, gambling housekeepers, and those who levied tribute on these houses on their own account were threatened with the galleys, and also those prisoners who, under pretext of an offering for certain holy images, levied a tax upon the other prisoners. Moni remarks very truly that the etymology of camorra shows its Spanish origin. The word in Spanish means a quarrel, brawl, or dispute, and camarista signifies a bad character. The Arabic word kumar means a gambling game. We learn from a novel of Cervantes that at about the time we have been speaking of there was an association in Seville exactly corresponding to the camorra. This society likewise levied tribute upon every thief for an image, which was held in special reverence, gave the police a part of its gains, and undertook to execute private acts of revenge, including the sfregio, or face-slashing. To this association were attached novices, called minor brothers, who had to hand over the entire proceeds of their thefts for the first half-year, carrying messages to the major brothers in prison, and perform subordinate offices generally. The major brothers had a common surname, and shared equitably the sums which the associates turned into the common treasury. The thieves in Morocco also levy a tax upon the prostitutes. Societies entirely similar to the camorra have existed in all imperfectly civilized periods. Thus Scalia was found mentioned in the Middle Ages in the rules of the Stinch prison and the prisons of Parma, abuses like those of the camorra, especially in connection with gambling. We read that each roomful of prisoners had its chief, called capitano, or podesta, precisely in the modern camorrists have their priore, and this medieval camorra used to tax the newcomers, just as is the custom today. In Don Quixote we are told how certain idle folk exacted a share of the gains of lucky gamblers in return for a prediction of the lucky or unlucky plays. This is the ordinary mission of the modern camorrist. Brigandage, which persists with obstinacy in southern Italy and in Sardinia, probably has origin in historic tradition, for it already existed in the most ancient times in central and southern Italy, and Strabo mentions it in connection with Sardinia. In the kingdom of Naples, writes Gianon, volume 4, 10, there were always bandits in the train of the invaders, Greek, Lombard, Saracen, Angevin, or Albanian, all alike thievish, cruel, and greedy. Subchapter 95. Religion, Morals, Politics. In countries where civilization is not yet firmly established, there exists no clear notion of morals and justice, and religion is often but the accomplice or instigator of crime. In Bari there was said daily the Mass of the Brigands, at the expense of the Brigand Pasquale. We are blessed by God, he said to a friend, the Gospel say so. The state of morality naturally falls in with these notions of religion. In Naples, 1877, an Esposito, after having assassinated an ex-camorrist by order of his chief, went to give himself up to justice in order to protect his superior from arrest. An applauding crowd accompanied him to the prison and covered him with flowers like a hero. Onofrio. Where justice is quite powerless, the injured person must necessarily have recourse to his own strength or that of his friends. If honour is at stake, he will seek a private revenge, or if it is a question of stolen property, he will come into a friendly understanding with the thieves. In Sicily, as was seen in the Lombard trial, One pays a certain sum to recover a stolen house or sheep, or the thief may pay a certain sum to the person robbed, in order to avoid persecution or the recovery of the stolen property. This proceeding recalls at every point the customs of primitive justice. There is another and very potent cause that favours the formation of associations of criminals in civilized countries. This is the admiration inspired in the weak by brute strength. Anyone who has seen, in the midst of an effeminate population with their soft flesh, soft speech, and weak character, a real Camorrist, with martial brows, iron muscles, and rolling R's, comprehends at once that if the Camorra had not been brought in, it would have risen of its own accord, as the inevitable result of the contrast between the energetic individuals and the sheep-like multitude. Even the Camorrist bows to this law. A strong and violent man himself, he bows to one stronger and more violent. Monier cites a very curious proof of this influence. A Calabrian priest imprisoned as the result of an affair of gallantry, upon entering the prison, was asked to pay the usual tax to the Camorra. He refused, and being threatened replied that if he had been armed no one would have dared to use threats with him. "If that is all," said the Camorrist, and in the twinkling of an eye offered him 2 knives, only dropped dead the next moment. The same evening the homicidal priest, who feared the vengeance of the Camorra more than he did the justice of the Bourbon government, to his great astonishment found himself offered the office of Barratolo in their society. He had been admitted as a Camorrist with his own wish. The same adventure happened to another Calabrian, who refused to pay the tax and threatened with his knife the man who tried to collect it. Onofrio writes, "In Sicily they call anyone who has courage mafioso." The Camorra is thus the expression of the natural self-reliance of the strong when they see themselves surrounded only by weaklings. But it is not only the strength of the few that maintains this state of things, but also the fear that the many. The brigand Lombroso declared that the warmest partisans of his enterprise were the respectable landowners, who, from fear of making him their enemy, told him of the house of their neighbours that he might rob. They did not realize, he added, that they in their turn would be pointed out by others, so that in the end they lost much more than if they had combined against me. A single unarmed Camorrist, writes Mortimer, shows himself in the midst of a crowd of thousands of people and demands his tribute. He is submissively obeyed, much more so than if he were the regular tax collector. The spirit of the Camorra, writes Mordre, persists in Naples, that is to say, intimidation persists as the result of arrogance and presumption. Monier explains the long persistence of the Camorra and brigandage in southern Italy by the dominance of fear. The religion taught by the priest was nothing but the fear of the devil. The prevailing politics consisted of nothing but fear of the king, who held the middle class in subjection through fear of the proletariat. While both classes were kept in order through the fear of a brutal military and police force, fear took the place of conscience and devotion to duty. Order is kept not by elevating man, but by degrading him. And what happened? Fear became a ready weapon in the hands of the most violent. Subchapter 96. Barbarism. Aside from what has been stated above, many other circumstances belonging to a state of semi-civilization may have an influence upon the prevalence of brigandage. Such a state of society offers more opportunity for successful ambuscades and safe passages of refuge. Thus the forests of Sora, Vesuto, Eselea, Fraiola, and Silla were always a resort of brigands, and the same is true in France of the forests of Osquier, Rouvray, etc. For similar reasons, localities largely uninhabited and not connected with others by frequent roads are favourable for brigands, and it is never known to persist in countries crossed by numerous good highways with many towns. The province of Syracuse, which is better provided with roads than any other in Sicily, has no brigands, while Basilicata, in which in 1870 91 out of 124 communes had no roads, was the province most infested with brigands. Subchapter 97. Bad Government. In Mexico, not so very many years ago, the sons of noble families thought it entirely proper to commit highway robbery, just as was the case in Paris in 1400 and in Venice in 1600. In the last years of the pontificate of Clement XIV, there were recorded 12,000 homicides, of which 4,000 were in Rome itself. In Venice up to the time of Napoleon, there still existed the so-called bulli, who domineered over the people at pleasure, entirely by means of the terror they had managed to inspire. To comprehend the unhappy condition in which society was reduced at this period is enough to recall that the most famous men of the Republic were publicly banished for ignominious crimes. It is enough to cite Morosini, Camaro, Falieri, and Mocenigo. Says Molmenti, in the memorial addressed to the Emperor by the communes of Castiglione, Medol, and Solferino against Ferdinand II. Gonzaga, it was proved that the assassins of the prince had murdered poor peasants, cut off their heads, and exposed them in an iron cage under the walls of the Castiglione. These men-at-arms burned farmhouses and barns, plundered the dwellings, stole money, cattle and furniture, and cut down or rooted up the vineyards. Even in the Republic of San Marco, which, though fallen into decay, still preserved a reputation for strictness. The depredations of bandits were frequent, especially in the last 2 centuries. All precautions, laws, threats, and punishments often remained ineffectual. If a Venetian nobleman committed a crime, the government immediately sent a band of men into the city whose peace he had disturbed. But the population, in whom the criminal inspired the greatest respect, protected him, and the noble delinquent found a safe retreat in his own castle. The magistrates themselves, almost all nobles, after publishing decrees and sentences against the offender and making loud threats, suffered the man to fall into oblivion. The ambassador of the Venetian Republic in Milan, sword in hand, claimed that he possessed the right of asylum. So when one morning the chief of the Milan city guard and his men passed before his residence, the ambassador, to punish such audacity, had a volley fired at them and killed or wounded several. Finally, in the times of Cartouche, there existed in Paris something which resembled, if not the Camorra, at least the Sicilian mafia. The thieves at that time were organized into bands and had accomplices even in the ranks of the police. They had swayed over bailiffs and spies, and enrolled a whole population in their number: innkeepers, porters, watchmakers, tailors, armourers, even physicians. In France in 1500, the Burgundians and Bohemians were veritable bands of brigands composed of vagrants and soldiers of fortune, who, as society became more and more civilized, withdrew into the forests of Rouvray and Estrelles, where fugitives from the civil wars went to increase their number. Subchapter 98. Weapons. Another matter which has great influence in promoting brigandage is the carrying of weapons and familiarity with their use. The gladiators in old Roman times were the most terrible leaders of bands of brigands and transformed their companies into veritable armies. Tomasi Crudeli says quite rightly, in the whole of southern Italy, beginning with the Campagna, the knife is not to be regarded as an implement of treachery, but rather as the sword of the people. Almost always, in fact, its use is preceded by a formal challenge. The custom of holding these duels is so deeply rooted that during the disarming of the Sicilian populace, there were established in all the districts of Palermo hiding places in the walls, known to all the inhabitants in the districts where they hid their knives, and which they got them in case of a dispute. Subchapter 99. Idleness. The prevalence of the mafia in Palermo is due to the absence of any manufacturing industry, and to the influence of the monasteries, which is favourable to idleness. Certainly priests and monks have always been among the causes of brigandage. The province of Naples in the 18th century, out of 4 million inhabitants, had 115,000 ecclesiastics, of whom half were monks. Each village of 3,000 inhabitants had at least 50 priests. The priests made begging not only a trade, they made it a work of merit. One of the principal causes of brigandage and the Camorra, says Monnier, was the custom widespread among the Napoleonians of letting their children from the age of 3 on grow up in the street. There they learned to beg and to swear by all the saints that they were orphans and dying of hunger. The beggar soon became a rogue, and being cast in prison became a member of the Camorra. If he was brave, or his victim, if he was a coward. The mild and fertile climate of Naples, as well as that of Palermo, is a help to idleness and tempts the inhabitants to lounge in the streets, and it furnishes the means of life at little expense, as not let the need and duty of working be felt. This is why associations of malefactors are more frequent in the principal cities, especially in the south, where the violent passions are more likely to provoke certain classes of crime. The formation of societies of criminals plainly depends upon the character and conditions of the country. Thus we see the Mafia and Camorra springing up again after they had been broken up and all their members deported. In 1860-61, a great number of Camorras were deported from Naples. Yet after a short period of depression, the Camorra was more active than ever, and now dares to threaten the electoral councils, the Palladium of Italy. The Mafia, destroyed in Palermo in 1860, rose again in 1866, armed and powerful. The Camorra, annihilated in 1874 by Mordini, was resuscitated in 1877 under the regime of Nicotera, and if it not installed its members in the highest places in the city government, it certainly has a tremendous influence in the elections. In Messina, in 1866, the Camorra was destroyed, literally, by the execution of its 29 leaders. But the men who accomplished this feat, having the reputation of being brave men, made use of it to carry on the Camorra themselves as actively as their predecessors, or even more so. Subchapter 100. Poverty. Much has been said with regard to the effect of poverty. The pictures which Filari has drawn of the condition of our people in the south are so horrible as to make us shudder. In Sicily, he writes, there is no other relation between peasant and landlord than that of oppressor and oppressed. If there comes a bad year, the peasant returns home from his labours empty-handed. If the year is a good one, then usurers take the place of hail, grasshoppers, storms, and hurricanes. The peasants are a troop of barbarians in the heart of the island, and it is not so much against the government that they rise up, as against usury and oppression of which they are the victims. If they execrate every form of government, it is because they believe that all governments sustain their oppressors. That poverty, however, has not all the importance that Filari would like to attribute to it, though it certainly has a great deal. It is evident when one considers the facts more critically. Thus the district of Montreal, which is certainly one of the least poor in Sicily, is just that in which the Mafia recruits its worst members from among the well-to-do classes. Naples, too, where the Camorra rules, is certainly not in a worse condition than Calabria. Artina, whose criminality has been described above, is one of the richest districts in the province of Rome. Moreover, the Camorra draws more victims than true accomplices from among the poor of Naples. Subchapter 101. Hybrid civilization. Still worse than the lack of civilization as regards the encouragement of criminal societies is a mixture of civilization and barbarism, such as is found in certain parts of Italy and in a large portion of America, where we see peoples, still half barbarous, subjected to a system borrowed from more civilized nations. While the advantages of both stages of society are lacking, the harmful features of both are present. Thus great cities, the increase of wealth, and food too delicate, increase vagrancy, rape, and theft, and make the discovery of crime less easy, while the jury system, the respect for personal liberty, and the ease of getting pardons are frequently causes of impunity and crime. The system of elective officers, especially when, as in some states in America, is extended even to the judiciary, offers the criminal class a new instrument of power and illicit gain. We see associated crime extend its power to the press, to the election of legislators, and in America to the election of judges, thus gaining a double advantage, immediate gain and future immunity. Subchapter 102. Wars and Insurrections. Political disturbances again, wars and uprisings, are factors to be taken into account in this connection. The gathering of crowds, great excitement, the ease of obtaining arms, and the relaxed vigilance of the government are all natural causes of the association of criminals. Bands so formed may become bold enough to make themselves real political factors. This is the explanation of the atrocities of Alcolia and of the Paris Commune, and of the more recent events of a similar nature in Mexico and New Orleans. These occurrences, which have become unusual nowadays, in former times were very frequent. In the Middle Ages, the tyranny of the barons gave to brigandage the appearance of a kind of social institution, defending the vassals or avenging them upon their lords, who in their turn regarded robbery as a noble trade. So also in ancient times, the 10 years which followed the restoration of Sulla were a golden age for the robbers and pirates of Italy. In 1793, in Paris, at the time of the free distribution of bread, so many vagabonds and criminals crowded in that strangers were warned not to go out at night, if they did not wish to be robbed. The thieves carried their boldness so far that they closed the highway with ropes. Charles de Rouge was chief of a band which plundered the large farms, presenting himself as a commissary of the Republic. During the Napoleonic Wars, there appeared in the invaded countries a band of robbers called the Army of the Moon. This sham army had its sham shoulders and sham officers, and plundered conquerors and conquered alike. In earlier times, there were similar bands who followed the Goths and Vandals into Italy. In modern Italy, when the Bourbons withdrew from Naples to Rome, brigandage raged in Abruzzo, and when, under Murat, the trade of brigand became dangerous, the Bourbons landed the convicts of Sicily and Calabria. He who stole the most was best received by the king. Criminal acts, writes Coletta, lost in consequence their criminal character, and crime became a kind of trade carried on all over the kingdom. To the eyes of one who recognizes the essentially immoral character of war, this breaking out of criminality is not surprising. Spencer, in his splendid study of ethics, has showed that the warlike peoples are always the most vicious. Subchapter 103 Leaders. At any given moment, in a country where criminal elements are plentiful, there rises a criminal who is a genius, or has great audacity, or an influential social position. We see criminal associations rise and multiply, as it was to the great intelligence of their leaders at the bands of Lacenaire, Lombardo, Stratmatter, Hessel, Maino, Motio, La Galla, and Tweed owe their origin and long impunity. Cavalcanti was a robber chief of such genius that almost all his followers were fortunate than those of Alexander became themselves leaders of terrible bands, like Canossa, Egedion, etc. The band of assassins and incendiaries of Longpierre escaped all inquiry because they were organized and protected by Galmand, the mayor of the place, who by incendiary fires revenged himself upon his political opponents or depreciated goods that he wanted to purchase. Subchapter 104 Prisons. But the principal cause of associated crime has been, and still is, the gathering together of criminals in prisons not constructed on the cellular system. Almost all the criminal chiefs, Maino, Lombardo, La Galla, Lacenaire, Soffard, Horduin, and others, have been men who have escaped from the galleys and have chosen their accomplices from among their companions who had their given proofs of boldness and ferocity. It is in prison that the Camorra rose, and it is there also that it first held sway. But when, under King Ferdinand in 1830, many convicts were set at liberty by the royal clemency, they carried over into free life illicit gains and dissolute manners to which they had become accustomed. Only a few years ago the Camorra chose its chief from among the prisoners in the Vicaria, and the free Camorrists made no important decision without first consulting these chiefs. In Palermo, the criminal got his professional education in prison, and novices without prison experience were admitted only into such enterprises as required a large number of persons. This will appear natural enough if we recall the words of the criminal of Palermo quoted in the preceding chapter. Prison is a piece of good fortune that heaven sends us, because it teaches us fit places and companions for stealing. Subchapter 105 Influence of Race. We have already spoken of the influence of race upon crime. The same thing is naturally true of association of criminals. The gypsies, like the Bedouins, may be called a race of associated malefactors. According to Mori, the Negro in the United States, and in southern Italy, the Albanians, Greeks, and at times even the native population, show the same tendency to associated crime. St. Jordi said, in speaking of Sora, "This beautiful country swarms with thieves. There are as many of them as there are inhabitants." This fact explains how brigands succeed in getting themselves elected as communal councillors. The inhabitants of Castlefort and of Spigno protect the thieves on condition that they practice their calling outside the district. The people in the neighbourhood of Palermo, among whom the mafiosi swarm, are descended from the breviers of the ancient barons, or, to trace their lineage still further back, from rapacious Arab conquerors, blood brothers of the Bedouins. I have noticed, writes D. Azeglio, speaking of the Romans, that in the ancient fiefs of the Middle Ages, Colonna, Orsini, Savello, there has remained in the population the imprint of that life of hatred, war, and division which was a normal yearly round in those unhappy countries. nearly all the young men exemplify the true type of the bravo. Subchapter 106. Heredity. These questions of race resolve themselves finally, as a matter of course, into the question of heredity. Among the modern brigands of southern Italy, there have been some who descended from the terrible Fra Diavolo. Many among the famous Camorras are brothers, and we know of the 7 Mazzardi brothers, the Manzi brothers, the Vadarelli, and the Legalis. In the United States, the younger brothers who robbed banks in Minnesota in broad daylight are weakly notorious. The band of Cusito and that of Nathan were composed of parents, brothers, and brothers-in-law. Here too the influence of hereditary, tradition, and education is added the power of numbers. A family of criminals is a band already formed, which from the fact of parentage has the means of increasing and perpetuating itself in the children. In 1821 the communes of Raleigh and Rosiers were afflicted with thefts and homicides, showing on the part of the authors a great knowledge of the locality and uncommon boldness. Terror prevented the laying of information, but the criminals were finally discovered and were found to belong to one family. In 1832 the thefts were renewed, and the guilty persons were no other than the nephews of the first lot of criminals. In 1852 and the years immediately following assassinations occurred again in the same communes. The murderers proved to be the great-nephews of the earlier offenders, who had been active 30 years before. These facts explain to us why we see a constant recrudescence of crime in a given village. It is enough that a single one of these perverted families should survive in order to corrupt the whole district, through the elective affinity there is between criminals. This justifies to a certain extent the barbarity of the ancients and of savages in punishing with the guilty their innocent relatives. Subchapter 107. Other causes. Criminals combine very often, from necessity also, in order to be able to resist an armed force, or to escape the search of the police by removing themselves from the scene of their crimes, though there is a tendency on the part of nearly all criminal bands to commit their misdeeds just around the circle of their own district. Again, the necessity of supplying a lack of certain qualities may lead to association. Thus, Le Canard, who was a coward, joined himself to Avril, who was fierce and bloody, while Meno and La Galla, who were courageous but ignorant, associated with them Ferraris and Davanzel, who were educated. Most criminals seek in others a courage they lack themselves. It may be added that for many of these people a crime is a sort of pleasure expedition, which is not so enjoyable unless carried on in company. At times an association has an entirely accidental origin. Thus Tepes, just out of prison, started to rob a drunken man, when he heard himself called by Fourier, who wanted to share the booty. From this chance meeting sprung the Tepes band. The most accidental circumstances, says Mayhew, such as the fact of living in the same neighbourhood or street, or bearing the same name, or meeting when coming out of prison, etc., gives rise to the bands of petty thieves of London. Spagliardi tells us of the meeting places of the gamins, and where bands of thieves have their origin in Lombardy. End of section 17.